Today we're going to finish Christmas at the movies. We're grateful that you're with us. Do you know this only happens every 7 years? Unless there's a leap year, someone told me. But every 7 years, where Christmas lands on Christmas on a Sunday. So you always wonder, does everyone go to church on a Sunday? Because that's the time of year a lot of people go to church. It's Christmas and Easter, or did they do that before? And so we're always wrestling. But thank you for all you singers that are singing today and helped us out. And Connor, I appreciate your songs and your leadership. And thank you. We're going to get you out of here in good time so you can get together with family. But I want to talk about a gift that we all have. And it's a gift that Christ has given to us. And if you are just coming and joining us today for the first time, you're catching the very tail end of Christmas at the movies. We're going to do the movie Home Alone. If you haven't seen it, it's a fun movie to watch as a family. But I think you'll see some similarities to what we're going to share today. Jesus used stories all the time. We've talked about this. Jesus used stories to help people relate to what he was trying to say. Many of you remember this story Jesus told of a son who took his father's inheritance. He asked for it before he passed away, took his father's inheritance, and he went and he squandered this wealth that he was given on wild living. And when he realized that he was starving and had no food left to eat, he realized, what am I going to do? And he went and made his way back to home. He didn't even want to be part of the family. He wanted to be a servant. But his father said, no way. We're celebrating and we're going to have a great big party. And there was a older son who was like, are you kidding, Dad? You're welcoming him back? And he didn't go to the party. He just complained to his father. Jesus told another story about a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he tells this story of him getting robbed and beaten and left for dead. And then he starts what we would think is a joke, where he says, we have a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And now this story comes real because the priest passed by on the other side. The Levite passed by on the other side, even though they saw him lying there. But the Samaritan stopped. The Samaritan got down and helped this poor man. He bandaged his wounds. He poured oil and wine on him. He put him on his own donkey. He brought him to the inn. He took care of him. And he even gave the innkeeper some money that if there was any extra costs to take care of this man. And then he asked this teacher, this expert in the law, he says, which one of these men was a neighbor to this man? And he couldn't even say the word Samaritan. He says, I guess the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus says, right, go and do likewise. Jesus didn't only use stories, he used current events. There is a part in Luke 13 where he says, or do you remember the 18 who died in the Tower of Siloam when that fell on them? Do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? So Jesus used current events, he used stories, he used whatever he could to kind of bring the message across. And he taught everyday people if they were willing to understand and listen. So we've been using movies to help teach something about ourselves and how we relate to God. And today we end on Christmas Day with Home Alone. Now, this movie is a timeless classic. If you've seen it, maybe, just maybe, and I want to pose this for you, maybe, just maybe, as the writers were sitting down to write this movie, they had an account in the Bible in mind. And I want to share that with you. Maybe. It's about a time when Jesus was 12 years old. And I want to see if you can see any similarities to the story when Jesus was 12 years old to the story of Home Alone. I want to read this through together. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover. This is in Luke chapter 2, 41 through 52. Why I love this is because there is not a lot said about Jesus as a child. It's his birth, and here we have this. And then we hear when he starts his ministry when he's 30 years old. So this is when he's 12 years old. When Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual. And after the celebration was over, they started home to Nazareth. But Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't miss him at first because they assumed he was among the other travelers. Now, if you've seen Home Alone, you'll understand what I'm talking about. There's a frantic little time where they're trying to get everybody on the plane to get to Paris. And they think that Kevin is with them, but he's not. Here in Jerusalem, they think Jesus is with them, but he's not. His parents didn't miss him at first because they assumed he was among the other travelers. But when he didn't show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. But when they couldn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to search for him there. 3 days later, could you imagine? Your 12-year-old son's been missing for 3 days, and however time it took to get back to Jerusalem. Later, they finally discovered him in the temple, sitting among the religious leaders, listening to them and asking questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. His parents didn't know what to think. Now think of yourself as a parent and losing your child. Son, his mother said to him, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic, searching for you everywhere. And Jesus' response was this, 12 years old, okay? Imagine your 12-year-old son responding, but why did you need to search? He asked, didn't you know I must be in my father's house? But they didn't understand what he meant. Then he returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And his mother stored all these things. Now, I want to just point out the word stored. Some of yours says pondered. Do you know that some of it really means this term wrestle? She had no idea how to put this into sense and make sense for her. She stored these things in her heart. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. Now, is it just coincidence? Or does this sound a lot like the movie Home Alone, maybe just backwards a little bit? I wonder if you have ever thought of what it would be like as parents to have a sinless child. And I know for some of you, you're thinking, well, just call my parents and ask them. But what would it have been like to have a sinless child? So before I move on, I just want to ask this question. What do you think, and why do you think that Luke thought it was important to put this portion of Scripture, or this story of Jesus, this account of Jesus in the Bible? No other gospel talked about him as a child. This is the only one. Why do you think he puts this snapshot of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke? There has to be a reason. Maybe it's so that Jesus is getting to the age of his bar mitzvah. Now, if you're not Jewish, we don't celebrate bar mitzvahs. We don't do that kind of thing. But when you get to the age of 13, you celebrate a bar mitzvah. And what that is, it's basically when a young child becomes a man. And as a man, he's expected now to follow the Torah in its fullest. By this time, Jesus most likely would have memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It would make a lot of sense of the conversation that he's having with those in the temple. Now, I know that Christmas time can be hard for a lot of people. See, a lot of people are getting together with family. A lot of people are getting together with people where there's friction. There's times when it's been difficult in your past. A lot of great memories for some people, but some not so great memories for others. And for some of you, your relationship with your parents is not all that great. And for some of you, it was abandonment. Some, it might have been abuse. For some, it was an absent father or an absent mother. And we all have these different stories. But for some of you, even your decision to become a Jesus follower caused so much friction in your family. And getting together around the holidays is very difficult for a lot of you. I want to talk about a family tension here for a moment. What would it have been like for Mary and Joseph to all of a sudden realize that they forgot their 12-year-old son back in Jerusalem? And they travel back 3 days. I just wonder what it would have been like to be in that conversation between Mary and Joseph. You left him. No, you left him. Now we got to go back. When we get a glimpse by what came out of Mary's mouth, son, his mother said, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic, searching for you everywhere. Yet I believe that it's Jesus' response is the reason why this is in Luke. Because I think it gives us a little glimpse as a transition is taking place. A transition from a place of mother and father to a heavenly Father, taking priority in a relationship. Jesus says, "Why did you need to search?" He asked. "Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" But it says they didn't understand what he meant. And here's the big point. This may not always be easy for us to fully understand, but I believe, and I could be wrong, that this is the reason that it's in here. Jesus was giving us a glimpse into the importance of God, our Heavenly Father, coming first in all our other earthly relationships. And this is going to be a really important as we get to the conclusion of this message, because we're going to be talking about forgiveness. And I believe this is something that we can all take today as we move towards time with family and with friends. This is going to be something that's really countercultural. Doesn't make sense. I believe it even goes beyond the words of the law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and goes to the heart of the law. And Jesus is going to talk about this in just a minute. But when God takes priority in our lives, only then will we be able to love each other the way that we've been asked to love. But I'm jumping ahead, so let's get back to the movie for a second. This movie, the writers, I'm sure, were sitting around and someone says, "Hey, do you remember the story in the Bible of Jesus when he was 12 years old? Do you remember that his parents forgot him? What if we made a movie about a kid being separated from his parents at Christmas time?" And so they start this plot. And this is Kevin McAllister, who is Macaulay Culkin as a young boy. And this was written by John Hughes. But Macaulay Culkin, or Kevin, we'll call him Kevin, that's his name in the movie, is accidentally left behind when his family takes off for a vacation in Paris. See, this all happened because Kevin was in a little argument with his brother the day before. And so at night, he had to go sleep on the 3rd floor. But during the night, the power went out and all the alarm clocks got switched off. And so as the buses are coming to pick the whole family up to take them to the airport, there's a frantic running around trying to get ready. And during this time, Kevin is just sleeping upstairs. And by the time they get to the airport, they get on the plane, they start searching for Kevin and realize he's not with them. Now, Kevin had got into a huge argument with his brother the night before. And so this is where he's upstairs and he's complaining and wishing that his family would disappear. And so Kevin wakes up to find the whole house empty. And at first he's overjoyed. That's what we would do, right? As maybe he's 12 years old. Maybe he starts just thinking, "Hey, I can do anything I want," which he does. He actually helps himself to Buzz's financial situation, his life savings in his room. He practices shooting Buzz's BB gun. Then he jumps on the bed. And then he watches a gangster film. And then he eats as much junk food as he can get down. And Kevin does everything any kid would do when he realizes you have the whole house to yourself. And watch out, nowadays we have cameras. So your parents probably know exactly what you're doing. Once he realizes they've left him at home by himself, Kevin has to learn to fend for himself. And the reason being, because these two guys are going to rob his house. They're burglars. They want to rob every house in this neighborhood. On Christmas Eve, Kevin overhears Harry and Marv making plans to break in to his house that night. And it's here where Kevin really begins to miss his family. He starts to feel really alone. He even asks some Santa Claus impersonator if he could bring his family back for Christmas. But during this time, he heads to a church in hopes that maybe God will bring his family back. And he's sitting in church and he's listening to a rehearsal happening of a performance that's going to happen that night. And he meets somebody. He meets his neighbor. And here's his neighbor. It's Old Man Marley. And I want to show you this picture because Old Man Marley was not in the original screenplay. At least the ending part we're going to talk about today. They made it really sentimental, and I'm going to use this analogy for us today. Here's Old Man Marley. This is how Kevin sees him. It's pretty scary. But just to bring you up to speed, earlier in the movie, Kevin, his brother Buzz tells him that their neighbor is a serial killer. And he's out to get any kid anywhere. And so he says that he turns them into mummies and he places them in a trash can full of salt. And this is obviously not true, but this is how Kevin sees his neighbor. And he believes it's true. So every time he comes in contact with him, he runs away. So throughout the movie, Kevin's fear of Marley is evident. His first contact is when he sees him and he screams when he sees him outside, bumps into him, and he runs back in the house. Then he sees him at a drugstore, and he accidentally steals a toothbrush while he bumps into them there, and he runs. And so the audience begins to see Old Man Marley as a scary man as well. But then we learn better. And this is what I want to focus on this morning. The character of Old Man Marley, this part at least, did not exist in the original screenplay, and it's the church scene. So Old Man Marley comes to Kevin and as he's sitting there, and he says, "You live next to me, don't you?" Kevin nods. He says, "You can say hello to me when you see me. You don't have to be afraid. There's a lot of things going around about me, but none of it's true. Okay?" And this immediately diffuses all the tension that Kevin is now not afraid of Marley. But this is the main message. Marley explains to Kevin that he is there to watch his granddaughter in her recital or in her practicing for the night coming up, the performance coming up. But he can't be at the original performance. He has to be there for where she's practicing. And so this conversation starts. And he explains to Kevin what happened. He goes, "We lost our tempers." This is about him, Marley, and his son. "We lost our tempers, and I said I didn't care to see him anymore. He said the same, and we haven't spoken to each other since." The only time he gets to see his granddaughter is when his son is not around. And Kevin says this. He says, "If you miss him, why don't you call him? I'm afraid if I call that he won't talk to me." How do you know? I don't know. I'm just afraid he won't. No offense, this is Kevin, little 12-year-old. But aren't you a little old to be afraid? "You can be a little old for a lot of things," Marley said, "but you're never too old to be afraid." And here we see Marley is still afraid of tension within the family that happened years ago. He can't even celebrate Christmas with his son because of this argument that he had years ago. And because of this, he can't spend time with his granddaughter. Now, maybe some of you are feeling similar. Maybe within your own family, there's been tension. And it's hard to let go of any of that tension or that conflict because you were really hurt. And maybe you've put barriers up not to be hurt again. And all our circumstances are different. And so we can't blanket this with one kind of formula as to how to deal with that. But we all know how painful this can be when hurts and betrayals or abuse are in our relationships. And over time, the pain hardens and the grudges last long, and we build up calluses in defenses against those who've hurt us. See, forgiveness is a practice of letting go, of suffering caused by someone else's wrongdoing. It does not mean excusing. It does not mean overlooking or even forgetting at times. But instead, it involves changing the relationship through understanding, through compassion, and release. This is where Kevin urges Marley to make up with his son and ask for forgiveness. It's through his conversation that Kevin realizes that he hasn't really even approached his family all that well, even though they haven't been that nice to him at all. But at least he's not in the place where Old Man Marley is. See, Marley's case of unforgiveness demonstrates what can happen over time as it turns into fear and gets way out of control. And maybe for some of you, you experience this. You can end up losing something really valuable purely through being unwilling to forgive. And Marley becomes this great example for Kevin of what he doesn't want for his family. And even though he's a really nice guy, Kevin doesn't want to make the same mistakes as old man Marley. But what Kevin had said to Marley must have had an impact, because this is the scene that was going to be left out of the movie. It wasn't written in the original screenplay. But I don't know what it does. It gives me the feels. And I just think that it's really important that maybe right now you are wrestling through some time of unforgiveness. But I just want you to see the result in this next scene of what happens when forgiveness can take place. It doesn't always happen like this, but it can. And here we get a glimpse as to what Kevin sees the next day. We don't get to see the conversation Marley had between his son. We just get to see the result of it. Here it is.
Kevin! What did you do to my room?
Kevin's family's back. His brother Buzz is back. But this feeling, it's a result of what moving towards conflict, towards reconciliation can look like. And here Kevin now gets to spend Christmas with his family as they're all back. I just want to point out one major point and leave you with this morning. It's in a story that Jesus shares. Here Jesus is going to use another story to talk about forgiveness. And he's going to use this idea of debt, of thousands of dollars compared to millions of dollars. And I just want us to look at this. It's a conversation that Jesus is having with Peter. There's one thing I want you to get out of this today. There's so many layers to this, so many deeper meanings, but for today, I just want one thing. And here is the conversation in Matthew 18, 21 through 35. And this is all familiar to a lot of us, but I just want to see the one thing where I think we can get some help from and help us to move towards reconciliation. Then Peter came to him and asked, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? No, not 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. Now, if you're a Bible scholar or a nerd, you love to read the Bible, you'll know that the number 7 has more meaning than just a numerical value. And so when Jesus says no, but 70 times 7, it doesn't mean we should actually do the calculation and say, okay, that's how many times I need to forgive. What Jesus is saying is, you need to forgive all the time. Listen to this. Therefore, he's about to tell a story. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with a servant who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay. So his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. I love this. But the man fell down before his master and he begged him, please be patient with me and I will pay it all. Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him from and forgave his debt. Now, I don't want you to miss this. This means that he didn't have to work really super hard to pay off his debt. He was forgiven and it was canceled until something happens. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s, not millions, just a few thousand. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. That looks nothing like the king at all. Demanding instant payment. Here he says, his fellow servant fell down just like he did before the king. He fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me and I will pay it, he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested, put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. Remember, this man's debt had been canceled. The king then called in the man he had forgiven, and he said, "You evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?" Then the angry king sent the man to prison, the very thing he was going to do to the one who owed him only a few $1,000s, to be tortured until he could pay his entire debt. And then this is what this says. Jesus goes, "That's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart." Merry Christmas. Man, this hits hard for me, and I'm sure for some of you. I don't want you to think this is easy, but I believe that Jesus is giving us a lens to look at through how much we have been forgiven. In this parable, Jesus is presenting a principle that would have come across to really foreign to them, because they would have been familiar with this idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus is taking this to a whole new level. What Jesus is trying to teach us is that until we have a good idea as to just how much we are in debt and how much of a debt of ourselves has been canceled and that our sin has been wiped away, then and only then will we be able to forgive others. Otherwise, we will always wrestle with the fact of just how much are we to forgive others. And in the parable, the first servant's debt was completely forgiven until he went to this other servant of his for only a few $1,000s and refused to cancel his debt. And he actually does something. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. Now, I just wonder, do you see anything really wrong with this sentence? How on earth is this man ever to pay this debt from in prison? But how many times have I, have you, have we done that to someone by refusing to even move towards the conflict or forgetting about any type of reconciliation, just like old man Marley over all those years with his son? And what if we, by refusing to move towards that conflict, couldn't see any results in our relationships, just like old man Marley got to see with his son, with reconciliation once that takes place? And that's difficult. That's difficult for me. I'm sure it's difficult for you, but I believe this is what Jesus is trying to get across. I know that all circumstances that require forgiveness look different. Yet I do believe that many of these situations could be very different if we made a choice to move towards the conflict and release that other person from the prisons that we put them in. And the truth is, my debt, your debt, was paid in full by Jesus Christ himself. And this is where we're coming today. We're coming to remember the greatest gift ever. The greatest gift ever was the forgiveness that Jesus gave us by taking our debt and canceling it, putting it on himself. He became sin for us. And I don't know where that sits with you. The first servant had been forgiven all until he would not forgive the one that owed him money. And I'm not sure, again, what this looks like for you, but maybe it's a phone call. Like, obviously, Mr. Marley had a phone call with his son. But there was reconciliation that happened. Maybe it's a text. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's a coffee. And I believe there's so many layers to this teaching, but I just wanted to pull that one thing out, is how many people in our lives have we kept in a prison because we've refused to forgive them. And it's not easy, but until we look through the lens of what Jesus has done for us and how much we have been forgiven. See, forgiveness is a choice. It's a decision that we make. And maybe, just maybe, there's a relationship in your life that can be restored and released from the prison that you're keeping someone in, or someone else is keeping you in. When we focus on Jesus, the one who forgave the greatest debt of all. And now we can have a relationship with God because of what Jesus has done for us. So we're going to remember Christ together. If you do not have a communion packet, I'm going to ask if you can. There's some at the back. And we're just going to celebrate the forgiveness that Christ offers us through his death, his burial, and his resurrection.